The year is 3100 before the Common Era. In the middle of the harsh Saharan desert, a river flows slowly to the sea. The locals call it Iteru, meaning the Great River, but nowadays we call it River Nile. On its fertile banks, many small warring kingdoms are fighting for supremacy. And the idea of one man ruling all over this huge valley is just a pipe dream.
But this was about to change. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of King Narmer, the first pharaoh of Egypt. Follow me, and I'll bring you in the mists of time.
Our story begins in one morning of February 1914. A French man was strolling around the dusty roads of Cairo. His name was George Aaron Benedict, and he was a veteran archaeologist who knew ancient Egypt like the back of his hand. Mr. Benedict really loved the antique shops of Cairo, as here you could always find some forgotten treasures from the age of the pyramids. But he was totally unaware of being so close to the most important discovery of his life. George crossed the entrance of an antique shop and he began to rummage through the many objects that were displayed. Among old pottery, small stone statues, and other trinkets from a bygone age, something captured his attention. He found an ivory handle and an obsidian blade of an intense caramel color. The shopkeeper underestimated the historical value of the objects, and he didn't realize that the blade and the handle were originally welded into a ceremonial knife. The knife appeared as much older as anything Mr. Benedict had ever seen. And believe me, he had seen very ancient things indeed. George Benedict quickly understood that this knife was like a window on a lost and ancient world. So he bought the artifact and he began to study it intensively. 1 month later, he sent a letter to the Egyptian Antiquity Department of the Louvre Museum of Paris. It's an archaic flint knife with an ivory handle of the greatest beauty. This is the masterpiece of pre-dynastic sculpture, executed with remarkable finesse and elegance. This is a work of great detail, and the interest of what is represented extends even beyond the artistic value of the artifact. It is, in definitive, intangible and summary form, the first chapter of the history of Egypt.
This remarkable object took the name of Gebel el-Arak's knife, from the place where the antique dealer said it had been found. According to Mr. Benedict, it dated back to the very beginning of the Egyptian era. So, this is a very old item indeed, but how old it is, and why does it matter? The Gebel el-Arak knife can be dated around the year 3450 BC. Egypt was in the so-called pre-dynastic era. That is just a fancy way to say that the land of the Nile was in its prehistory.
Before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before anything we associate to the extraordinary 40 centuries of Egyptian history, the Nile Valley was divided into small farming communities. Villages of mud houses and reed huts dotted the landscape. Each one was ruled by its own leader. Slowly these villages grew more and more, and they became small kingdoms. The knife that George had in his hands was made in one of these proto-states. It was a ritual object that marked the high status of a great leader. Today we are used to having elaborate objects at our disposal, and we tend to forget how much knowledge, time, effort and money are needed to create everything we own. But just try to imagine how difficult it was to create such an elegant knife in that ancient era. It was a job that required months of hard and precise work by some great master of arts.
The elaborate images on the handle are not simple decorations that someone made in a hurry. They are very powerful statements. They show in the most intimate way what kind of world the people of the time were living in.
So let's try to step in the shoes of a prehistoric Egyptian for a moment. It doesn't matter if you are a simple farmer or a great leader of men. Your destiny and your future are tied to the river Nile. This narrow strip of running water is the heart of your entire universe. The flooding of its banks provides rich soil for agriculture, but the floods are not predictable. And you know very well what happens when everybody has a bad harvest. Your father told you that his ancestors used to live in a green and lush land, far away from the great river. But now you and your family are tied to these capricious banks. This is a harsh environment, and competition for resources is inevitable. 5,000 years ago, the rain pattern in North Africa was quite different from today. The whole region was much greener, and many semi-nomadic pastoral tribes used to live far from the river's banks. Slowly the climate became drier, and the desert advanced in an incredible way. A grand mass of people moved toward the Nile, creating a big pressure on the local resources.
Countless wars were waged to take control of the farming lands. Who knows how many warriors were acclaimed by their people as heroes, and how many died in the attempt of saving their communities from starvation. We don't know their names, and probably will never do. Almost everything seemed to be lost in the mists of time, until George Aaron Benedite found this extraordinary artifact in that morning of February 1914. So on the handle of the Gebel el-Arak knife we can see a snapshot of this conflict. Of course, it doesn't describe any specific war, but it can help us to understand the point of view of prehistoric Egyptians.
Carved on the handle, we can see soldiers who are fighting a bloody battle with the weapons of the time. Maces, clubs, and even throwing sticks, which are a sort of Egyptian boomerangs. Meanwhile, a fleet of river boats is trying to take control of the Nile. The corpses of the fallen warriors are floating on the water. On the knife, we can see wild animals fighting too. In the middle of the brawl, a man stands out. All by himself, he captures and he divides two beasts. The man is one of the kings of the region, and his message was quite clear for the people of the time. My domain marks the borders of civilization. What is beyond is pure chaos. Who doesn't live under my rule is like a wild animal. In this troubled era, 3 cities emerged as the main political players. Each one was ruled by a hereditary monarchy of powerful warrior chieftains. The first city was Nekhen. It gained its wealth thanks to the trading activities with Nubia, the region that today we call Sudan. The second city was Nabt, which means the Golden One. This name comes from Wadi Hammamat, an area rich in stone quarries and gold mines. The third city was Tinis. It controlled the traffic on the Nile thanks to its position in a narrow gap that the river has carved in the hills. the three cities could not easily coexist. For 2 centuries, they struggled to overtake the region and to prevail on each other. Then, the leaders of Tinis were able to conquer Nabt by taking control of the desert routes. In this way, they cut off the Golden City from the main trade network, forcing the people of Nabt to recognize Tinis' supremacy. Nekhen was Tinis' next target. Mighty walls were built to defend the city, but they proved to be useless. In the end, Tinis became the supreme ruler of the southern region of the Nile Valley.
From the pre-dynastic turmoil, a man emerged as the sole ruler of the land of the Nile. His name was Narmer, and he was the leader of Tinis. Narmer is considered the last ruler of prehistoric Egypt and the first pharaoh of all time. We don't know much about him or about his dynasty, as these events were not recorded in writing. But lucky for us, a glimpse from the past can be seen on an object called the Narmer palette. Palettes were stone tablets that were used to prepare sacred cosmetics. A cavity was used to grind pigments, like you do with a mortar and pestle. But palettes were not only fashion tools. They had a very important religious aspect too, and the Narmer palette can help us to understand this bygone age.
On the top of the palette, there's the name of the king. It's represented as a stinging catfish with a chisel. It was probably a way to describe his aggressive political attitude, but academia is still discussing the symbol's true meaning. On the stone, we find a scene that shares elements with the handle of the Gebel el-Arak knife. Wild animals, somehow mythical and dangerous, are captured and tamed. This scene symbolizes how the strength of the man is imprinted on nature. But this strength is not imposed on wild nature only. On the palette we can see a terrible scene. Narmer is wearing the white crown of southern Egypt and is about to crush a prisoner's head. Above the prisoner there's the falcon of the god Horus and some papyrus flowers, the symbol of northern Egypt. The papyrus is humanized with a head that Horus keeps tied with a rope to represent the conquest of the region. Who is this man? Maybe he's one of the kings that Narmer defeated in battle? Sadly, his name has been lost in the mists of time. In the next scene, we can see Narmer now wearing the red crown of northern Egypt. He's leading a well-organized army, and they are leaving behind a large amount of decapitated corpses. Finally, a big bull is destroying a fortified city. This artifact is like a stone book that describes the unification of Egypt under one single king. For centuries, the Nile was divided into many small kingdoms, but now one man could claim to rule them all.
As you have noticed, the two crowns have an important role in the palette's narration. The white crown was called Hedjet, and it was the symbol of power in the south. On the flip side, the red crown's name was Dejret, and it was the symbol of the north. When Narmer unified Egypt, he invented a new concept that was called the Peskent. It was the so-called United Crown. It represented the two kingdoms forged under one single man. For more than 3,000 years, this crown has been the emblem of Egypt. In some way, it was like the British Union Jack. But take a moment and think about it. 3,000 years. It's a longer time span than the one that divides us from the life of Julius Caesar. To me, that's simply incredible.
Sadly, we can only speculate on how Narmer conquered the country. Trying to reconstruct the unification war from the palette is not hard. It's impossible. This is like trying to understand World War II from these random photos. But here and there, we have bits of information about what happened after the unification of Egypt. Narmer had extended his rule from the south to the north of Egypt. However, he didn't impose his will on this territory as a colonizer. The conqueror tried to reconcile the two parts of his kingdom. In fact, we know that his wife's name was Nibhotep, which can be translated as "May Nib be blessed." Nib was the goddess of Sas, a city in the north. This name shows us a policy of reconciliation after the bloody war that we have seen depicted on the palette. Narmer founded a new royal capital in a more central position to better control the north. The city was known at the time as Imbuhet, which means white walls. But you may know white walls simply as Memphis, a name that resonates through the ages.
Narmer was able to create very strong foundations for his state, and for more than 4 centuries, his heirs will dominate Egypt. Under their rule, the Egyptian writing system will be developed furthermore. Great monuments will be built, and the country will be truly unified on a cultural level. But eventually, something greater will happen. The age of the pyramids builders was just behind the corner.